All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's 12 noon here in New York City, where I'm based. Thank you so much for your participation today. We are delighted you're with us for our Cultural Wisdom webinar to learn more about achieving objectives on your virtual teams. I'd just like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Sean DeBerk, and I'm Director of Training at RW3 Cultural Wisdom. I'll be leading the webinar today. We've also got Joshua Sturdivant, our Chief Technology Officer and Vice President. He'll be producing the webinar. And we also have Charlene Solomon, our President, on the line. So today we're going to cover all of these items in about 45 minutes. We're going to start by taking a look at some of the key challenges we uncovered through our virtual team survey, which we conducted here at RW3 last year. Then we're going to review the Virtual Teams tool, which is a resource available to you all on the Culture Wizard site, in addition to how that video course can support your virtual teamwork. And then we're lucky enough to have an interview with Peter Bregman to take a look at his insights as a renowned author and leadership coach. We'll also review some tactics that you can employ right away to be a more effective virtual team member. And as a bonus, at the very end, we will show you how you can enter to win a Kindle Fire by completing a trust audit on the Virtual Teams tool, which is a great way to figure out what your team can do to build trust, which we're going to discuss in a moment. Actually, it's a vital component of effective virtual collaboration. Now, Josh is going to share a link in the chat pod right now to get to our virtual team survey report. So if you're interested in the findings that we uncovered, I'd go ahead and click on that and have you read that at a later time. But we conducted this survey with a large group of global professionals and uncovered a number of key challenges. All respondents said that it is far more challenging to be effective on a virtual team in comparison to teams that are co-located or teams that work in the same office. We found that the largest barrier to being effective was a lack of face-to-face contact and not being able to read nonverbal cues, which often leads to misunderstandings related to cultural differences. And from our research and from the survey, we've actually conducted 2 surveys over 2 years around virtual teams, and we've found that the majority of challenges have to do with these 4 areas: culture, language, time zones, and technology. Now, we have asked you to complete some pre-work on the Culture Wizard site by taking the Culture Calculator self-assessment. So I want to ask that you take a look at your profile throughout the webinar today to understand and refresh how your personal preferences may or may not be effective in the virtual environment that we find ourselves in on a daily basis. So, for example, if you were to take a look at the relationship dimension on this sample profile, the individual from the UK is far more transactional than his or her counterpart in India, who really needs to build a trusting relationship to engage in business and to be productive. So what does it mean to build a relationship? What constitutes a relationship in this sense? We're going to take a look at ways you can do that and how you can really be more effective as a result. As we look at challenges, you can actually find much of the content of today's program on the Virtual Teams tool. This is actually a screenshot from the Virtual Teams tool, which is available on the Culture Wizard Learning Platform. Don't worry about finding it now. At the end of our session, I will direct you to that site, to that resource, so you can access that yourself. So what I do want to say, though, is that while technology makes it possible to connect people that are very far away from each other, it really isn't the most natural form of human interaction. And trust is really the core of any successful virtual team, but it's very hard to establish on virtual teams because of the different value systems that inform the way we feel about building trust. In some cases, it's assumed because I know that you are working for a credible organization. In other cases, it doesn't matter where you work. It really depends on the personal connection, the personal relationship that you build. And communication styles also complicate the trust-building process. In some cultures, folks are very loquacious. They like to talk and express themselves, and they use body language to support the delivery of their communication. In others, folks are quite reserved and economic in the way that they speak and use words. And in some cases, interruptions are very much the norm, whereas that's not what people are used to in other cultures. So you can just imagine this complex picture of a virtual team, and also the varying needs for background and context. In some cultures, more in-depth, detailed information is really a requirement before someone feels comfortable moving forward with a task. So how is that working on your virtual teams? Relationships, as I've mentioned already, are a crucial component of any virtual team. If you're thinking about the idea of diving into a working virtual relationship, where you don't have the usual space or time to kind of go out and have a coffee with someone or to go have lunch with someone because they're so far away, on a personal level, this can impede, the lack of that kind of relationship opportunity can impede people from certain cultures from doing their best work. And the language and time zone factors are ones that we're all familiar with, because we all know what it's like to take a call at 5 a.m. or at midnight or at some awful hour when we're not really ready to put forward our best work. So it's important to spread that burden of having to talk at odd hours of the day by scheduling calls on a rotation. This also helps maximize the contributions of team members, because you give a different impression of yourself when you're functioning at 100% versus 60%. So these are some of the key challenges that I want to have us keep in mind. And the idea that cross-cultural interaction is a challenge, as it is in a face-to-face or an in-person environment, well, those same challenges are really magnified and exaggerated in virtual environments for all of these reasons that we've just explored. So it's really crucial that we make sure we have a clear understanding of what culture is, because that's what's going to enable us to be successful as virtual team members. And culture really defines everything that has to do with doing business. It defines how we communicate, how we relate to each other, how we resolve conflict. So keep that in the back of your mind as we segue now to an interview with Peter Bregman. We're very, very fortunate to have gotten this interview with Peter, who is a coach to CEOs, to senior executives and their teams. He's also an author of the best-selling book, 18 Minutes, Find Your Focus, Master Distraction, and Get the Right Things Done. He is also a regular contributor to Fox Business News and the Harvard Business Review. So let's take a look at what Peter has to say.
My name is Peter Bregman. I run a company called Bregman Partners. The work that I do is as an advisor to CEOs and their leadership teams. I spend a tremendous amount of time working to break down silos. I've written a few books. My most recent one is called 18 Minutes, Find Your Focus, Master Distraction, and Get the Right Things Done. The single biggest mistake that I see all executives make, senior executives included, is the assumption that the way that they're operating is the way that other people operate, and the way that they're speaking or the issues that they bring to bear will be understood in the way that they meant it to be understood. I see this often, by the way, with Americans who are very direct, very straightforward. And so the challenge of appreciating that what is comfortable for you is not necessarily comfortable for the other, and understanding how to convey the message in a way where it can be heard by the other instead of dismissed. The biggest challenge that I've seen is a challenge of trust across cultures. So, for example, France. That I'm operating in France. I'm running the French office, and in fact, I'm running Europe from France. And I'm sitting at the executive table with a bunch of Americans. The biggest challenge I've seen is, can I trust that you Americans aren't trying to take over what I'm doing in France, or aren't trying to minimize our office because you see it as a satellite office and you don't actually care enough what's happening locally. And I approach it really caring more about what's happening locally than I do care about kind of what's happening globally for the company. And as Americans, I think maybe I'm focused on the global picture, but in fact, to the French person's eyes, all I'm caring about is America. I'm not caring about the global view. I just think America is the global view. And so the trust between countries, between leaders in each country, that becomes the cultural wall to get over more is to say, I don't think you're trying to mess up my country or my geographic area. In fact, the countries and the different cultures become, in effect, the functions that we prioritize over the larger organization. One of the ways in which you start to build that trust or break down the mistrust is that you get diverse groups of people from the various cultures all focused on grappling with the same issue where they're trying and going for an outcome that they all care about. I am a huge proponent of more human ways of communicating than computers. So in my view, email is the least effective trust building mechanism. That if you already have deep levels of trust, email won't hurt them for the most part. But I've never seen email effectively used to build trust where trust isn't there, and that it's really the human element that's really necessary. Almost all of us have screens with videos on them, and in my view, they are tremendously underused, and that it would be much more effective if people just clicked on their video and actually could look at each other. I remember the very, very first video conference I did in the early 90s. And I was giving a speech, and there were maybe 40 people in the room, and it was with India, and I think it was Mumbai, and it was a pretty nice video conference center, but this was the early 90s, or maybe it was the mid 90s, so it wasn't great. And someone sneezed, and I said, "God bless you." Now, forget about the fact that probably "God bless you" was the wrong thing to say when someone from India sneezes. I don't know, but the fact that it suddenly hit me that it was a gut reaction of mine to say, Gesundheit or God bless you, or to say something when someone sneezed when they were, thousands and thousands of miles away from me, speaks to, even then with the video quality back then, how human the element is of just seeing someone on another screen and talking to them on a screen like that. And certainly our technology has gotten so much better. So I'm a big proponent of that. I'm also a proponent of sending people things. Send them a bottle of wine. Send them connect with people on a human level, person to person. And the more you do that, pick up a phone if you can't do that, and if you can't do the video conference, and have the conversation with them. But the human element of seeing a face, of listening to a voice, that's really, really critical in terms of building the kind of trust that we're trying to build.
All right, so we're going to go back to Peter in a bit, but I do want to touch on Peter's key points. The first of which is trust. And trust is probably the main challenge for developing high-performing virtual teams. And it's important to find ways to build trust, and one of those is to build and develop stronger personal relationships. And so it really does help to include some informal personal conversation time when you've got virtual meetings, talking about your daily life, what you're doing on the weekend, what the weather is like, just giving people a glimpse into a view into what your life is like 5,000 miles away, asking questions, cultural questions, talking about business, talking about things that may not be so relevant to that specific meeting can help foster those relationships. And also add that personal kind of human touch that Peter was talking about. Now, email is not the best way to build relationships. We use it a lot, and it works as a tool to communicate and ask people to do stuff for you, but it doesn't really do the relationship building aspect very well. So this actually reminds me of a client that I've worked with who told me about people in the organization that used email in an extremely blunt, direct, and brief way. Emails that would contain a few words at most to kind of send a message. And people on the receiving end would be spending a lot of time trying to figure out and decipher what that person intended to say due to that extreme brevity. So, sharing extra details with virtual teammates is a really great way to not only strengthen the relationships and to show that you trust them, that you want to give them information to really help them do what they need to do, but over communicating avoids that pitfall of sending messages that are not sufficiently detailed so that your colleagues can respond in the best way. Sharing gifts is another great idea, although of course you do need to be aware of your organization's policies around gift giving, but it is a wonderful thing that you can do to really add, again, a human touch. If that's not possible, personal recognition is great. If it's a letter, if it's a handwritten letter that you send in the mail with a stamp, I think it's even nicer. I always remember those more than anything because I only get a few of them nowadays. But these are the key points that Peter just brought up, and I want to take a second look at email because I've got a video, a cross-cultural business scenario that I'd like to look at that addresses email and virtual project management. So let's take a look at this one.
Hello, Dimitri?
Yes, speaking.
It's Nicole Finch, Service Delivery Executive in Toronto.
Yes, Miss Finch. Nice to hear from you. How are you?
Good, thank you. Listen, I'm sorry to trouble you again, but as you mentioned in our phone call from the other day, I emailed your boss and requested the data that I need for that comprehensive report I'm charged with putting together.
Yes.
Well, that was 3 days ago. Then yesterday I sent him a follow-up email, again requesting the information, and he still has not responded.
And you still have not heard from him?
No, and I'm starting to get concerned that we're going to miss the deadline.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, have you tried call him directly?
No, I've been relying on email.
Well, Miss Finch, perhaps you should call him. I believe he's in the office now.
Could you connect me to him?
Sure, but I'll first let him know who you are. Perhaps you could call him in a few minutes.
I was hoping to get this done by email, or at least a brief phone call.
Well, I'll try him now.
Okay, I guess that's what I should have done in the first place.
Yes, that might have been preferable.
All right, so what happened here? In this specific Russian cultural context, the email Nicole sent didn't really work in the way that she had hoped it to work. So, sending email could have been really effective for her in her home country, perhaps with colleagues that she works with and that are of the same cultural background, that use email in the same way. But it didn't really send the right message here. It wasn't received by her Russian colleague and read with the same importance that she intended to send it with. So at certain times, you do need to ask yourself, do I need to elevate my approach here and pick up the phone, or if possible, make an in-person visit? But that's something that we do need to pay attention to be effective. Now, hierarchy also played a role in this video, and if you know anything about Russia, organizations and business tend to be very stratified. Hierarchy, status, and rank have a lot to do with the way that you approach folks in the organization. So who contacts whom and how should you contact people in a hierarchical organization is another question that Nicole Finch should have asked herself in trying to solve this problem of getting her work done.
Sean, we have a question that's come through on that topic. How do you deal with using the right format of communication across time zones when people may not be available?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, that's a great question. So dealing with email and time zones, and I think especially responsiveness, when you've got colleagues that are, for me, it's definitely colleagues that are in the 12-hour mark, so people 12 hours ahead of me that are basically, we're starting and ending our days at the same time. It tends to be difficult, and I like to create drafts of emails that I then remember to send, which later in my evening, basically. So I'm trying to reach China, which is 12 hours ahead of me, but I want them to read the email at the start of their day so they can respond. So I actually do some work when I get home. Now, this is the reality of global business. Being open 24/7 is probably the only way we're going to be able to get work done with people that are far away. But I line up emails that I send later on in the evening, which doesn't take much work. It's just a matter of sending them at the right moment so that folks on the receiving end are getting them at a time of day where they're more likely to respond. So I hope that answers your question. That's what I'm reading your question as. Now, I want to move on to take a closer look at trust, which we should be thinking of as the glue that keeps a team in this high-performing state that we're all trying to get them to. Trust is a very complex concept, and you can't get great collaboration on a virtual team if there is little trust. So it's really important to know that trust is earned differently from culture to culture. People extend trust to their colleagues in different ways from culture to culture, so you can't assume that it exists, especially at the outset of a new virtual team. So in essence, trust needs to be established and maintained because it can also be easily damaged by cultural misunderstandings. I'm looking back at the chat here just to make sure that I've answered the question. I agree with that question as well. How do you deal with different time zones when shifts don't overlap? So, I mean, that's another tough issue that we've got to grapple with. We're going to talk about time zones and best practices in a moment, so hopefully we'll address that when we get there. So, continuing on with trust, what are some of the different forms of trust, the different ways that we can build trust? So, according to the Reina Trust Building Institute, trust is built and reinforced incrementally and reciprocally in these three ways: through competency, through communication, and through contracts, through keeping agreements. So let's look at these in a little more detail. The three types of transactional trust that the Reina Institute has modeled. Trust that we need to transact business is what how you can think about this. So competency trust is all about the recognition of people's strengths, their skills and their abilities, and also in their ability to learn new skills and to learn how to do business in different ways. So the idea that you've got people on your team because they have the skills and the capacity to perform at the level that you need them to perform. Now, contractual trust is all about keeping agreements. The idea that you can count on me to do this work. And also doing what you say you're going to do will help build that contractual trust. That's very important here. Communication trust is all about the process of sharing information, disclosing information in clear ways, and also thinking about the amount of information that you feel you need to share or that you need to entrust unto others for them to do a good job for you and vice versa. Speaking with good purpose is part of that. Giving feedback in the appropriate way is another aspect of communication trust. Do you give feedback in a public forum where everyone can hear the feedback you may have for an individual, for a team, or do you have to take that offline into a one-on-one conversation to avoid an individual feeling that they have lost face by giving them constructive feedback in front of their peers? So these types of trust are crucial, we think, to this process. And the erosion of trust is also something that we should look at. Obviously, trust erodes when folks fail to meet commitments, but trust also erodes when we fail to acknowledge individuals or teams for their contributions. And this happens involuntarily, I've noticed. We may be so pressed for time that we don't take a moment to acknowledge individuals, to celebrate their success, and to give credit where it's deserved. Conversely, stealing credit, which again could happen involuntarily, where lots of work is being put in from a whole team and it's unclear as to who's done what, but inadvertently stealing credit, that individual who feels that they've done the lion's share of the work will obviously feel that there is less trust. They may lose focus, they may doubt their own skills, and in general, productivity tends to plummet. I see that there's some good conversation going on in the chat pod. I think it's wonderful for you guys to be talking about some of this stuff as I'm discussing. I'm going to move on to some ways that you can build trust. I'm not going to read all of these points, but I suggest that you take a look at them. We build trust with our colleagues by delivering on expectations. In a nutshell, that's how we do it. The twist here is that those expectations that we have of one another are defined by our cultural backgrounds. So in an increasingly global and multicultural business world, the expectations that we set for each other are quite diverse. So it is really important to understand that it's difficult to build trust in a global setting without explicitly setting expectations and making very clear that your colleagues and your teams understand what those expectations are and that everyone should be following them. So all of these items can help build trust, but I would indicate that you should really be alert to indirect communication styles where you'll need to read between the lines a bit more. And we're going to look at some best practices for clarifying communication and for really listening actively when you're on virtual meetings, because that's a key component of anyone who partakes in virtual work. So with that, let's go back to Peter Bregman's interview to take a look at some of the other issues that he's highlighted.
Another issue that is critically important is communication. And of course, that's intertwined with trust because we build trust through communication in many ways. And the communication is really critically important. And it's important from a cultural perspective, not just because of language barriers and translation issues, but because of the natural expectations that we have about how people behave, which are consistent within our culture, but often off with other cultures. And even what I say is an expectation, you won't necessarily call it an expectation. My expectations about time will be different than your expectations about time. So the challenge is to be really clear upfront about what is it that you're hearing, what do you understand needs to get done. And what's hard and what we have to learn about is what are the kinds of things that, or the kinds of expectations that are culturally dependent, so that I know what to ask you about and what you might misinterpret from me. Because if I don't really understand which expectations are culturally dependent and which aren't, then I'm probably going to go overboard on one side or I'm going to miss something. And setting those expectations becomes really, really critically important in my view. I recently wrote an article for Harvard Business Review focused on what I called the most overlooked leadership skill, and that's the skill of receiving. And the analogy that I used was in playing ultimate frisbee, which is a game very similar to the U.S. Game of football, that I could throw a terrible pass, and yet if I've got a great receiver on the other side, they'll be able to fly through the air and still catch it, and that they've been able to save the throw. And the idea of receiving is very, very much overlooked, and receiving everything, but receiving information, receiving someone else's emotion or energy, or being able to kind of hold the space for them, to be able to listen effectively to what other people are saying, even if it's critical of you. That's a very, very hard skill to learn because it's very emotional, and yet it's critical. And what I would say is that leaders and executives and anyone really who's working cross-culturally really needs to have that skill. And another way of thinking about that skill is empathy. If I'm stepping into a role from a more local position to a more global position, or from a team where people are around me to a team where they're more virtual, or to a team where they're more multicultural, probably the number one skill and capability that I need is that of empathy, of really looking at something from someone else's perspective, of hearing the events that are happening, the conversation, the communication, of seeing what's going on from the vantage point or the viewpoint of the other. And that skill of empathy and cross-cultural communication is so important because it's this invisible boundary and barrier that gets in the way of conversations. Because if I'm really looking at it only from my perspective, I'm missing the person who's across from me. And that works if the person across from me is exactly like me, because then we'll both see it from my perspective. But if they're different than me, which is the case we're dealing with when we're talking about multicultural conversation and work, and by the way, almost all conversation and work is multicultural these days, then it's not enough to assume that the person across the table is just like me. That in fact, I have to assume that they're not just like me. And when I make that assumption, then the next step is, well, what are they like? And how do I begin to think like they think, and hear like they hear, and see like they see, and maybe even talk like they talk? And if I can do that, then I'll really be able to bridge that gap, and it'll be much more fluid to work with someone who's different than me, which really is the situation that we're all in right now anyway.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Now, with our last 15 minutes of our webinar today, I'd like to take a look at some best practices, but let's first take a poll to see what you are doing with your virtual teams. Josh is going to bring up 3 different polls here that I'd like you to start answering. that have to do with different activities and methods of doing your virtual work. So let's start by voting right now. All right, so starting with the first question, do you always send agendas in advance of virtual meetings? The results should be broadcast so you can see how folks are voting at the moment. It looks like a good majority are sending agendas in advance, and this is really crucial. In some places, agendas don't have a whole lot of purpose. Agendas may be created at the beginning of the meeting, kind of spontaneously, but it really helps for a lot of folks to see what a meeting is going to cover and to use that to prepare their thoughts, to prepare what they're going to say, what they're going to present, and it's a great way to get contributions from folks that may not typically feel comfortable brainstorming and talking openly and freely in a meeting because they are very much cognizant of their face, of presenting a good face, thinking about avoiding losing face by saying something inappropriate or irrelevant. The agenda and a meeting structure in advance really helps with that. Now, does your virtual team have written standards for effective interaction? The overwhelming majority here is no, and we're going to take a look at that in a moment. But having some written guidelines, a roadmap, a navigational document that helps a virtual team be a little bit more cohesive and align on some best practices for how they interact is a really crucial finding that we've been espousing here at RW3 for quite a long time. Now, I do see as well that 48 people voted no on using webcams or video conferences, while 33 voted yes. Okay, so there's a split there. I think that all of us have access to webcams, or at least know that they exist, and perhaps some of us may even have webcams, but we choose not to use them because we're a little apprehensive about being on webcam. Especially if we work from home, if we work remotely, we may not always be in a state where we feel like being on camera. But it's vital, I think, to prepare ourselves to do that more and more as we work virtually more and more as well. All right, so I actually want to address this middle poll here about creating standards first, because it is something that I think all of us should start doing. The idea that from culture to culture, expectations around teamwork and management vary quite a lot means that we really need a hybrid culture. We need a third culture that we create, that we invent ourselves as virtual teams to write down and to codify a set of norms, behavioral norms, practices that can act as that roadmap for virtual teams. And those practices can be as simple as something like, we're going to take certain conversations offline to avoid losing focus on our virtual meetings, to be aware of the fact that, okay, you know what, this is going off on a tangent. Let's take this online and address this after our group meeting. Or something like, let's join our meetings 5 minutes earlier. Let's factor in 5 minutes at the beginning of our virtual meetings to have some relationship building time, to talk about things that don't have to do with the meeting itself, that have to do with your personal lives, what's going on in the office here, what's going on with your family, how's the weather, stuff like that, to start fostering those closer personal relationships. But creating this roadmap, creating these standards for respectful and effective interaction are all about fostering an awareness of the different styles that exist on your team, and because each team is going to be very different from the next team, considering the cultural backgrounds and the personal styles that exist, you're going to need to have that meeting with your team to devise this roadmap yourself. So I just want to encourage that everyone think about how you might do that, perhaps at your next meeting, the next summit that you have. Maybe it's better to do this face-to-face to have everyone talk about this stuff, but it's crucial. I can't emphasize it enough. Now, communication, as Peter mentioned, is critical to making virtual teams work because we build trust through the way that we communicate. And this here is actually another shot from the virtual teams tool. So let's look at some of these important methods.
And Sean?
Yes.
Can I just interrupt here? We had a question about a deeper explanation about indirect communication. I think this would probably be a really good time to just describe it because we really refer to it a lot. So would that be possible for you to do?
Definitely, and I think actually, Shar, thank you so much for bringing that up. This next area about asking open-ended questions has very much to do with indirect communication styles, and it's actually I can give a story here that reminds me of a British firm where a manager. What I'm going to do is I'll tell the story first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about indirect communication and how the story connects to that. So a British firm actually hired an Indian company to create a web tool. And a British manager asked his service rep in India, can you build a web tool on our existing platform? Now that's a yes-no question, something that a direct communicator would very much tend to ask versus open-ended questions, which is what we're talking about on this slide. Now the response from the Indian colleague was, yes, we can do that. Indian culture values face, so that communicating directly where a no answer, while in the Indian person's mind may be more appropriate because they've got a better idea, saying yes is really what Indian culture teaches people to do. So that yes was an indirect yes, because I'm going to tell you the rest of the story and you can see why it was an indirect yes. In the end, this project ended up taking a whole month longer than they had anticipated because the British manager went back to the Indian service rep and asked, so why did it take so long? And the Indian colleague said, well, you know what, the platform you asked me to build the web tool on is really not the best for this kind of tool. And the British manager was flabbergasted because being a direct communicator, he expected that service rep to tell him the honest truth of what he thought as an expert in technology, what the best platform would have been. But because the idea, or rather the hierarchy of a client-service provider relationship prevented that Indian colleague from saying, actually, you know what, you're wrong in asking me to build this on this platform, because there's a much better platform that we could build this on that would probably be more effective. But because you've asked it and you're the client, you have a very high status. And in India, the culture of client relationships dictates that kind of a relationship. So the trap that this guy fell into in asking a question, a direct question, a yes-no question, can be avoided by kind of interpreting your responses from folks in a different way. So the indirect yes, what does that yes mean? Yes can often actually mean no. If you say yes, but, or yes, perhaps, or even someone who responds to a yes-no question by changing the subject, that's some kind of indication that that yes wasn't 100% yes, that's what I'm going to do. It could be yes, I heard you, yes, I understand. So the idea that indirect communication is a way to send a message more subtly, more circuitously, to satisfy the cultural values that one is brought up in, especially in India, saving face and being deferential to people in positions of authority, and a client is certainly a person that holds a high position in a client-service provider relationship, is really important to keep in mind. So you've got to ask questions like these. What do you think of that suggestion? I'd like you to build it on our existing platform. What do you think of that? And that doesn't beg a yes or a no. It begs a detailed kind of qualitative response. And that's the whole idea that all of us, I think, could start practicing. It's a simple idea, but changing the way that we instinctually go to ask questions is actually quite a challenge. And I've gone through it myself. Being American, being a direct person, wanting to ask a simple question with a yes or a no answer is not going to work for me when I'm working with folks in India or parts of Asia or a lot of different areas in the world. So I hope I answered that question. Charlene, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that's great. And anything, later we'll pick up some more questions later.
Wonderful. Great. Another area that we should take a look at is around verifying understanding. So just a simple act of paraphrasing, restating, repeating what you've just heard, whether it's via email or via phone, to clarify is a really key thing that you've got to do on virtual teams. It's easy to think that we've heard or we've read the answer that we want to hear in an email or in a phone conversation, but it's so important to avoid this trap by clarifying what you think you've understood, and especially, again, with indirect communicators. Restate what they've said in a slightly different way that still carries the meaning that you think it carries, and allow that person to respond, you know what, that's actually not what I meant. What I meant was this. And in addition to creating an agenda and sending those out in advance of your virtual meetings, it's duly important to send summary notes afterwards. This will help clear questions people might have that didn't feel comfortable asking questions in the first place because perhaps they're non-native speakers and they couldn't find the best way to kind of articulate their questions and to clarify. And also for those of us who are simply multitasking. This isn't just a cultural problem. We're all doing a lot of stuff all the time simultaneously. And we lose focus when we're on web meetings, such as the one that we're on right now. I mean, we've got a lot of chat going on here on the left side. I could lose focus immediately if I looked at some of these questions over here and lost focus on what I'm doing leading this session. But that multitasking also is an issue, and it's important to send notes afterwards that people can get and extract the full purpose of a virtual meeting. Practicing active listening. Going back to multitasking, Peter Bregman in his book 18 Minutes talks about how multitasking is in fact impossible. You can't really give your full attention to several things at one time. Now, whether or not that's true, it does imply some pretty serious stuff for us working on virtual teams. You really need to drop everything that you're doing when you're on virtual meetings, especially when you don't have the visual cues of a webcam, to truly listen to the person speaking, to suspend judgment, to focus on the facts and what people are trying to say, remembering that not everyone communicates the same way that you do. So you're going to have to do a little extra work to put yourself in the shoes of the other person, to take their perspective. And Peter's analogy to the U.S. game of football was a pretty great one. So virtual teams need strong receivers. They need people who know how to employ empathy when appropriate to avert some of these misunderstandings and the resulting loss of trust. Receiving information and deciphering it and translating it requires a lot of focus. And Mike's saying over here, active listening is a way to achieve that. Thinking of yourself as a receiver, while the information is coming at you in one way, it may not be the clearest way. As a leader, as a strong virtual teammate, you can receive that and also verify for understanding and restate out loud, which will probably help other people who may be wondering what is trying to be said on the call. So active listening, again, a simple thing, but can be very, very hard to do when you're distracted with your computers, with the internet, etc. Now, silence does not mean the same thing to everyone. And for those of us on the call who are very uncomfortable with silence, will associate pretty well, will relate well to this classic cross-cultural story that I'd like to share right now. So it goes like this. An American salesperson is in Japan pitching a product to a Japanese customer. He wants to sell a dozen units at $100 per. And in response to this quote, the Japanese customer is silent. The American then goes and reduces the price to $90 in response to that silence. And again, the Japanese customer doesn't have anything to say. So quick to fill that silence, the American goes back and says, okay, fine, $80. And the associate of that American salesperson later asks, why did you lower the price so much? The American was clearly interpreting that silence as, no, this price is way too high, but he didn't need to lower that price. He ended up selling the units to the Japanese customer's delight at $80 per unit. But he later found out that Japanese use silence and they use pauses as a way to show contemplation, to show consideration and respect for what was just said. So in effect, it worked against that discomfort with silence, and that inability to interpret what silence meant in this situation worked against the American that could have very well sold his product at the original price if he had allowed the Japanese customer to mull over their thoughts and do what was most normal for them. So not thinking about what you want to say next, but listening to who's talking and making sure you understand their message in the way they intend to send it, inclusive of silence, inclusive of pauses, and when you can, get the nonverbal stuff, which can also transmit through the phone. If you hear people breathing, sucking air between their teeth, about to say something, you can take that cue and use that to let people start talking. So there's lots of things that we can do here, and communicating in a culturally astute way is of vital importance. So what's next? I'd like to encourage everyone on our call today to go to the Virtual Teams tool on your Culture Wizard site. And more specifically, I'd like to point out the Trust Audit. Now, this is an image of the Trust Audit, which is a part of the Virtual Teams tool. And this is a really great way to define some methods that you can use to build trust on your team. Now, getting to this area of the Virtual Teams tool is as so. You log into the site. You can go to the Virtual Team Effectiveness track over here, second step. Click on Virtual Teams, which will launch the Virtual Teams tool. And then you can find the Trust Audit by going to the fourth section and clicking on the menu item that says Trust Audit. So with that, I would like to allot a few minutes. Actually, we've gone over time here, but I know that we've got some questions here. I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that one of my colleagues at RW3 may want to highlight from the list of questions here. And I also want to ask participants to let us know what you've learned today that you can implement right away to support effective virtual teamwork. You all know how to use the chat pod. You can type in some of these ideas. We'd love to hear what you're going to take away from this session and use to be a better member of your virtual teams.
It's great, Sean. One of the intense discussions that was going on in the chat box had to do with time zones, and as we know, it's one of the most difficult challenges that virtual teams face. It's just really, really tough. So the only thing I wanted to suggest is that there's really no way that we found, there's no way around really some people, especially if it's a global team, of some people being inconvenienced, sometimes greatly inconvenienced, taking a call at a time that's just very, very difficult. And that's the reason that you really want to change the time and change the people who are having that inconvenience, because there are times that people do need to have overlap and need to discuss things together and be there together. So that's the only way so far that we've found to deal with that time zone issue, and not to minimize it. I mean, if you're in the middle of a family evening and you need to get onto a very important call, a meeting call, and there's distractions at home, or if it's 4 a.m. for you, it's really tough. It's really tough. So if you have the power to change, or this could be one of the best practices that you do in your guidelines, and you discuss, how are we going to rotate the meeting times? And that was just something that I know that people were really interested in talking about.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful, Charlene. And I would also say that there are planners on the internet. There's actually one, if any of you remember from the registration page you used to sign up for this webinar, we included a link to a time zone meeting planner, which is a great little facility online where you type in where your participants are located, and it calculates a whole range of times that are going to be most convenient considering the spread of locations on your virtual team. So that's one thing that we like to use to really figure out how a global team can meet at the best time, and then also rotating to spread that burden. There's an idea here that I see from Leslie, including a photo, a family photo or a photo of yourself when you first join a team. Sending photos, I think, is wonderful, including it at the signature of your email, for example. If you can figure out how to do that, I think is great. But it really builds those relationships in the best way.
Sean, we had a couple of other really interesting suggestions. One was to avoid distractions by using a full screen. And the other one is to shut off your Outlook so that you're not getting those things that remind you that you've got a message coming in. And those help maintain focus on a virtual team. Great suggestions, folks.
Brilliant, yep. So we've got a lot of questions here. Let's see if we can answer one or two more before we close.
Sean, there's one on language barriers, and the question is when we say that a native speaker may dominate the conversation in a virtual team, and how to deal with it. What are some suggestions? And I think that actually you've touched on several of those that really directly relate to this. One is that if you send out an agenda ahead of time, it allows people who aren't possibly as skilled facile with the language to prepare. Another way is, to give others a little bit more time and to remember that there are people on the call, in the meeting, who are dealing in a second language. And so they just need a little bit more time to formulate the level of sophistication in the response that they want to give or in the remark that they want to give. And so I think, again, it's just a matter of being aware that these simple things that we take for granted every day need to just be rethought a little bit, and that it's not quite as easy as it is when you're dealing with a team that you can see who are from your same culture, who have same expectations. So those are just a couple of tips.
I would add to that, Charlene. Those are really great. From my own personal perspective, I speak Spanish as a second language. I'm fluent, but when I take business calls that I know are going to happen in Spanish, I can't tell you how helpful it is for me to know what the agenda is and for me to actually write out some of my thoughts so that when I speak in Spanish, although I speak it fluently, I know what I'm going to say, and I don't have to be spontaneously coming up with things that perhaps require some vocabulary that I don't know. I can look up in advance something, and I can kind of script out my thoughts so that I can put my best foot forward and really provide that information in that second language. So knowing what that's like on my end, it really does help to give people that time to think through their thoughts in advance and to write out their responses. And I bet that a lot of people who speak English as a second language are accustomed to doing so, especially at the beginning of their careers when they're just starting to learn all the business language in that second language. And then also, just telling the team, you know what, all of the English native speakers here tend to talk a lot. Let's pause for a minute and take 5 seconds between statements so that someone else can jump in, and so that there's not a constant battle between people who are comfortable interrupting themselves because they have a facility with the language. To give the team a second to regroup, and for those that are non-native speakers to speak up, or to even prepare in advance. Folks that you know have some great ideas and you want them to speak, give them a little speaking slot, 5 minutes at the right point during the meeting, and calling them out and say, okay, we're ready to hear from this person. What have you found out? And doing stuff like that, I think, can really balance that struggle between dominating native speakers and non-natives who want to talk but perhaps don't have the opportunity or can't find a space to jump in to the conversation.
Yeah, those are excellent ideas. Really, really great.
All right, so I think we've got lots of great questions. Unfortunately, we can't answer all of them. We've already gone over quite a bit here. I'm really appreciative of those who've stayed to listen to this question and answer round. So with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for your participation. Again, we will post a recording of this session on your Cultures site at the beginning of next week's on Monday. You can expect to find this recording and do share it with your colleagues freely. We're happy for you to do that. So thank you so much again for your participation, and have a great week.
Thank you.